time just to distinguish ourselves from every other conference I've ever been to. So I'd like to welcome you all very warmly to this conference on Romanticism, philosophy, literature, music that's been organized by my colleague Lena Steiner, or Steiner as we used to say when she was back in America. She and I both have names that lend themselves to a German context. The subject of this conference is, as the title says, and I came here to Bonn with various things that were dear to my heart that are partly realized through this conference. One was a closer preoccupation of philosophy with literature. There is, of course, a certain preoccupation with literature in philosophy already, but it's always seemed to me to be too partial and too limited in focus, too inflexible in certain ways. Part of the intuition there arose through working on ancient material, and if you work on ancient philosophy and take a broad enough perspective, you realize that most ancient philosophy had roots in literature, came out of literature. Eduard Seller, the great historian of ancient philosophy, tells you that about Homer and Greek philosophy, that Homer is really the source of it all. No doubt there are qualifications that need to be made to that, but there's a lot of truth in it too. If you look at moral philosophy, when it arose with Socrates in a serious way, quite clearly, I think, came out of theorizing in ancient tragedy that had occurred in the century before. And not only this, but when you preoccupy yourself with these themes, you quickly realize that in many cases the literature sort of got it right and the philosophy then went on to get it wrong. And you know, if you think about Homer on the character of the mind, Homer had a roughly physicalist conception of the mind, not a dualist conception of the mind. Homer thought that there was no such thing as an afterlife. When it's over, roughly. And then the philosophers came along and invented dualism and the afterlife, Pythagoras, Plato, and the rest of them, and sort of messed that topic up. And similar things happen in moral philosophy, I think. In moral philosophy, the tragedians didn't have a cognitivist, a sort of factual conception of the moral. They were aware of the complexity of moral life and moral dilemmas as a problem. Then Plato came along and messed those things up too, and so the whole topic of moral dilemmas sort of disappeared from philosophical treatments of morality for not only centuries but for thousands of years. So with those sorts of thoughts in mind about the ancient case and many others, I was very keen that philosophy and literature should have more of a conversation than they currently do, and a richer sort of conversation. And then the other relevant concern I came to Bonn with was about German Romanticism. The non-identical twin of German Romanticism, German idealism, is of course a big preoccupation of contemporary philosophers, both systematic and historians. But German Romanticism tends to get very neglected, not taken seriously at all by philosophers. And it seems to me that the reasons for this are thoroughly bad ones. To mention a few, just to give a sense of how one might, as a current philosopher, rethink that stance, that attitude towards German Romanticism. The anti-systematic character of German Romanticism is quite striking. Qualifications aside, the German Romantics are not systematized. In fact, they're hostile to systematizing in philosophy. And if you're brought up on Kant and Hegel and so on, you expect system in philosophy, right? But that's not actually a very good reason for not taking German Romanticism seriously, because there are actually very good arguments against systematizing in philosophy, not least that the attempts at systematizing that have been made, Kant's, Hegel's, Fichte's, and so on, all rather spectacularly fail when you look at the details. That there's a very, very unfortunate consequence of systematizing in overlooking new empirical evidence, or empirical evidence more generally, distorting its interpretation to fit your systematic scheme and so on. There are all sorts of good arguments against systematizing in philosophy. There's an anti-systematic tradition in philosophy, and Romanticism is a key part of it. Or you might worry about the feature of Romanticism that's very much in play today, that German Romanticism paradigmatically tried to fuse philosophy with literature, or more generally, theory with art. And this is a very emphatic theme in Friedrich Schlegel, for example. And philosophers are likely today to get very worried about this, because it looks like we're doing a sort of Rortian abandonment of philosophy for much more trivial things. But of course that's a very, very simplistic and misleading way of looking at the issue. And one way in which it is so is to one way of seeing that it is so is to realize that the fusion of literature with philosophy that the Romantics envisaged was at least as much a matter of making literature more theoretical as it was a matter of making philosophy more literary. And one side of that agenda was a very, very impressive, what you might call scientific concern with issues connected with literature, language more generally. It's perhaps not as well known as it ought to be that Friedrich Schlegel, among his many other achievements, was not only with Schleiermacher a serious philosopher of language, but also basically invented modern linguistics in his work of 1808 on the language and wisdom of the Indians. He was basically the inventor of that discipline. A.W. Schlegel, his brother, who taught here for many years at Bonn University, was the world's expert on prosody, on meter at the time. They were both, along with Schleiermacher, the leading theorists of interpretation and translation in the period, hermeneutics and theory of translation in the period, and so on and so forth. And so this fusion of philosophy with literature was a whole lot more, as it were, scientific, serious, than one is likely to assume if one doesn't sort of know the details of that story. And of course, the political dimension of Romanticism is also worth mentioning. One reads extraordinary misconceptions even today about what German Romanticism was about politically, as I was a nationalist, for example, and so on and so forth. The Romantics, at least in their serious period, in their early period, were liberal Democrats of a rather radical sort, in Friedrich Schlegel's case again, for example. They were committed cosmopolitans, believed in the moral dignity of all people. They were feminists, and so on and so forth. They were much, much more closely aligned, actually, with progressive political ideals of our own day than people who tend to get more credit in these areas, like Kant, who had some really rather awful views about some of these subjects. And so German Romanticism shouldn't be dismissed hastily by philosophy. On the contrary, I think it's at least as interesting philosophically for us today as German idealism. So with those few remarks about the topic of the conversation, mate, I want to say that with those sorts of concerns, one of the things I came to Bonn wanting to do was to set up a Forschungsstelle für Philosophie und Literatur, for philosophy and literature, a research center for philosophy and literature, which would, among other things, heavily preoccupy itself with German Romanticism. And I was fortunate enough in this plan to find not just a good person to take over this, the directorship of that research center, but the perfect person. Doesn't happen often in life. Usually it's just a matter of unendliche Annäherung. You're trying to find the ideal and you never get there. But I actually got there, and this person was Lena Steiner, my colleague, former colleague from the University of Chicago. Lena, who's organized this event, is an expert in comparative literature. She's a Slavist in particular, but more broadly an expert in comparative literature. And she also knows a lot about philosophy, including in particular German philosophy, and more particularly still German Romanticism. And so she was the perfect person for this project and is the director of this research center. And this event is really the first big event connected with her center, and she organized it in what, to me anyway, looks like a wonderful way, and I'm extremely grateful for all the work she put into this. So let me hand over the microphone for a minute or two to Lena, who will tell you a bit about the details of the event.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, microphone works. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Forster, for this generous introduction. It is my great honor to speak to you here today. I want to join Professor Forster in thanking you all for coming here. Some of you have flown all the way from Sydney, Chicago, New York. Some of you have come from Berlin, Köln, or Bonn. We thank you all very warmly for being here today and making this event happen. We have conceived this conference in the spirit of the Romantic Athenaeum. That is to say, we wanted deliberately to follow the Romantic tradition of sim philosophy, because we also believe that the best ideas are born out of productive collaborations between individuals, different fields, and different cultures. Thus, if you take a close look at our program, you will notice that the participants of this conference come from 14 academic institutions, if I have not miscounted, in 6 different countries, or some of them actually come from more than one country, so we have 7 or 8 different countries. They represent 7 or 8 different disciplines, and the native speakers of at least 8 different languages. Of course, all of you are also bilingual, and many of you are tri- and quadrilingual. This diversity makes our program extremely intense. So I want to ask you to hold on to your programs during the 3 days that we're going to spend here together in this beautiful Baroque Schloss, because the 3 days do not have a perfectly symmetrical structure. Should you develop any practical questions, please do not hesitate to turn to help to one of our student assistants. We have wonderful student assistants whom I'm going to thank right now for the help that they have provided so far. Eva Jeske is unfortunately not here, but she will come. Their names are Eva Jeske, Melanie Riedel. Melanie is sitting in the front row without a name tag. Simon Baskov, Timo Weiss, Virginia Lilly, Frederick Otto. They will be wearing name tags, so please do not hesitate to turn to them if you need any help, or to me. And my heartfelt thanks to the students for organizing this. Finally, we are going to record the proceedings of this conference. After the conference, we will send you the drafts of these recordings for your approval, as well as a consent form that we will ask you to sign in order to allow us to publish these recordings online. In case you do not want to appear on the internet, simply do not sign the form, and we will omit your presentation. Finally, coffee and tea are served, and water are served throughout the day in Gartensaal. Gartensaal is next door to the Stucksaal. And without much further ado, allow me to introduce my colleague Jens Romich from the University of Bonn, who will chair the first panel. Thank you.